What if your most valuable asset isn't in your bank account but in the chair behind your eyes? In How to Own Your Own Mind, Napoleon Hill shows that mastering your thought life is not mystical. It's a practical, repeatable business, an internal boardroom where ideas are evaluated, decisions are financed, and results are delivered. This introduction invites you to a strategic reboot where clarity of purpose, disciplined attention, and organized thought become your competitive advantages. Expect concrete tools for focus, persuasion, and memory, delivered with the blunt efficiency of a CEO and the quiet conviction of a craftsman, ready to stop letting your mind run you and start running your mind like the flagship enterprise it was meant to be. Let's own it. Chapter 1. To own your own mind begins with the recognition that your thinking is the single most influential tool you possess. This chapter opens by insisting that thought is not a passive phenomenon but a form of creative capital. It can be squandered in worry and confusion or invested with purpose to generate outcomes. The first step in mastering your mental domain is clarity of purpose. Know what you want and why you want it. When purpose is unclear, attention splinters. When it is sharpened, the mind aligns like a guided instrument toward productive action. The practical architecture of this process is built on 3 interlocking habits: the habit of focused attention, the habit of selective intake, and the habit of disciplined action. Focused attention means dedicating uninterrupted blocks of time to think about specific problems, decisions, or plans. During this time, the mind is trained to reject distractions and to hold single threads of thought long enough to weave them into coherent ideas. Selective intake means curating what you allow into your consciousness. Your mental environment is shaped by the people you converse with, the books you read, and the media you consume. Each input either strengthens or erodes the architecture of your thought. Disciplined action converts ideas into real-world experiments. Thought without action remains vapor. Action without thought becomes mechanical and wasteful. Together, these habits create a feedback loop that progressively sharpens judgment and produces measurable results. The chapter also highlights the danger of passive acceptance of other people's thinking as if it were automatically your own. Too many people live under the illusion that being told what to think by authorities or peers is equivalent to owning their minds. Ownership requires judgment, weighing evidence, testing assumptions, and making decisions deliberately. A practical exercise offered here is simple and repeatable. Each morning, in a short period of quiet, articulate your single, most important objective for the day. Write it down in the clearest possible sentence. Next, identify the single action that most directly serves that objective and commit to performing it within the first hour of your work. This routine trains your mind to prioritize and to transform vague intentions into focused deeds. The chapter closes with an admonition about fear and indecision. Fear is a thief of mental property because it scatters attention and diminishes the capacity for concentrated thought. The remedy is not wishful thinking, but the concrete practice of taking small, decisive steps that accumulate into confidence. Ownership of your mind is presented as both art and discipline. Art in the sense of cultivating creative ideas, discipline in the sense of imposing structure and habits that make creative thought reliable and repeatable. Chapter 2. Concentration is the operational core of mental ownership, and this chapter explores how to develop it in practical terms. Concentration is the ability to direct the mind at will and to hold it there until clarity emerges. The mechanisms that enable concentration are rhythm, routine, and resistance to novelty. Rhythm means establishing regular times for deep thinking, planning, and reflection. Human cognitive capacity responds to predictable patterns. A mind that knows when it will be called to intense work conserves energy until that moment and delivers a higher quality of thought. Routine supplies the scaffolding for sustained attention. When tasks are anchored in routine, the mind spends less energy on logistics and more on the substance of thinking. Resistance to novelty is the deliberate refusal to allow every new stimulus to commandeer attention. The modern mind is constantly assaulted by the trivial. Learning to say no to distractions is a skill that must be practiced like any other. The chapter offers concrete techniques to build concentration. One method involves timed focus sessions of modest length followed by deliberate rest. The idea is to work with intensity for a block of time that is challenging but sustainable, then withdraw to rest so the mind can consolidate. Another technique is the use of written prompts to sustain a line of thought. By capturing fleeting ideas on paper, the mind is free to return to the central thread without losing progress. Additionally, this chapter emphasizes the role of environment in facilitating concentration. Physical organization reduces cognitive load. A workspace cleared of clutter reduces the number of small decisions the mind must make and preserves attention for high-value thinking. Social environment matters too. Surrounding yourself with people who respect and protect your time multiplies your ability to concentrate. The chapter then addresses the importance of emotional regulation. Anxiety and impulsivity disrupt focus. Practices drawn from simple cognitive hygiene, controlled breathing, brief physical movement, and disciplined pauses before reacting improve the brain's capacity to engage deeply. Chapter 3. Memory and organized thinking are twin pillars for anyone who wants to claim their mind as an asset. This chapter reframes memory not as a passive storehouse, but as a curated database that should be deliberately structured to serve reasoning and decision-making. The first principle is association. Facts are best remembered when they are linked to vivid images, to personal stories, or to a chain of related concepts. Instead of trying to memorize in isolation, construct mental filaments that tie new information to what you already know. The method called chaining involves connecting ideas sequentially so that each link cues the next. Another method is the use of spatial memory, placing concepts along a mentally mapped route so that walking that route in imagination brings the ideas back in order. Both techniques transform forgettable data into retrievable patterns. The chapter also emphasizes the role of summary and repetition. After any significant reading or learning session, immediately summarize the core points in your own words. This forces synthesis, which is the engine of understanding. Spaced repetition then reinforces those summaries at increasing intervals so the memory trace strengthens without requiring constant re-exposure. The organization of thought requires not just memory techniques, but also frameworks for categorization. Create consistent folders, mental or literal, for different kinds of knowledge, tactical know-how, strategic principles, people and relationships, and personal benchmarks. When information is organized, retrieval becomes faster, and the mind spends less energy reorienting itself. Chapter 4. Decision-making is the executive function of the mind, and this chapter concentrates on how to make choices that reflect ownership rather than passivity. A decisive mind is characterized by clarity about goals, acceptance of limited information, and the willingness to act despite uncertainty. The chapter dispels the myth that perfect information is required for good decisions. In the real world, decisions are made under constraints, and excellence lies in establishing rules that guide action in predictable ways. The author proposes a decision protocol composed of a clear, objective statement, a short list of plausible options, and a time-limited test of one option. This protocol promotes momentum. Instead of endlessly deliberating, you commit to a small experiment that provides new information. Decision fatigue is addressed by reducing the number of trivial choices draining your cognitive budget. Simplify routine matters with fixed policies so the mind is preserved for strategic decisions. Another key concept is the use of guardrails. When outcomes carry high cost, build constraints that limit downside while preserving upside. For instance, pilot initiatives on a small scale use stop-loss thresholds and require periodic review points. Emotional intelligence is integral to good decision-making. Awareness of biases, confirmation bias, recency, loss aversion, allows you to design countermeasures such as seeking disconfirming evidence or rotating the people who review decisions. The chapter also encourages cultivating moral clarity. Decisions aligned with your core ethics are easier to execute and produce less internal conflict. Chapter 5. Creativity and imagination are not mystical gifts reserved for a few. They are mental muscles that can be exercised and shaped. This chapter reframes imagination as the laboratory where possibilities are combined and new strategies forged. Imagination comes in two modes, synthetic and creative. Synthetic imagination recombines existing ideas into new configurations. Creative imagination reaches across disciplines to form concepts that have not previously been associated. Both modes are valuable in business and life. The chapter offers practical ways to cultivate each. For synthetic imagination, regularly practice cross-pollination by exposing yourself to unrelated fields and forcing explicit connections. For example, take a principle from biology or music and ask how it might inform a problem in marketing or operations. For creative imagination, allow for unstructured time and play. Humor, metaphor, and absurd thought experiments stretch the mind beyond conventional constraints. Chapter 6. Mastering the habit of focused study transforms information into actionable wisdom, and this chapter outlines a disciplined approach that turns learning into a strategic advantage. The core argument is simple. Passive reading or casual exposure rarely changes behavior. Deliberate study with clear application transforms knowledge into power. Begin by defining precise learning objectives. Vague intentions, such as wanting to learn more, are the enemy of progress because they allow the mind to drift. Instead, specify the exact skill, principle, or outcome you want to extract from a study session. Once the objective is set, frame questions that your study must answer. Questions create mental hooks that make information retrieval easier and force the mind to look for relevance rather than merely accumulating facts. The chapter encourages a layered approach to study. First, skim broadly to build a scaffold of context. Second, read deeply to identify the structural principles. Third, synthesize by summarizing in your own words and writing down the implications for your particular situation. This triage prevents shallow familiarity and promotes usable understanding. Active engagement techniques are emphasized. Annotation should be purposeful. Highlight only when the highlight helps answer your guiding questions. Margin notes are not ornaments but signals for future review. Teach what you learn aloud or write a brief explanation as if explaining to a competent colleague. Teaching solidifies the neural pathways that transform passive recognition into active recall. The chapter also describes the importance of integration. New knowledge must be linked to existing frameworks in your mental library. When a new idea fits into a pre-existing folder, it becomes easier to access and apply. If no folder exists, create one and immediately test the idea against a real problem. Application is the acid test of study. If the idea does not help solve a problem, either refine it or discard it. Time management for study is practical and intentional. Short, regular intervals beat occasional marathon sessions. The brain consolidates learning during rest and sleep, so spacing study and allowing intervals for consolidation yields deeper retention. Chapter 7. Influence and persuasion are not tricks to manipulate others, but tools to align minds toward shared goals. This chapter reframes persuasion as disciplined communication built on clarity, credibility, and empathy. Effective influence begins with precise thinking because unclear ideas cannot be communicated persuasively. Before attempting to persuade, distill your argument to its core proposition and the single concrete benefit your audience will receive. People rarely change because of abstractions. They change when they clearly see how a choice improves their situation. The chapter explores the 3 pillars that make messages persuasive. The first pillar is credibility, knowledge, track record, and transparent motives. Credibility is earned by consistent behavior and by offering evidence in a form that the audience values. The second pillar is clarity. Simple, structured messages travel further than dense, clever prose. Use vivid examples and analogies that translate complex concepts into everyday experience. The third pillar is empathy. Understanding the audience's current beliefs, emotions, and constraints allows you to frame your message in a way that resonates rather than repels. The chapter warns against common persuasion pitfalls. Overloading people with facts without organizing them leads to confusion. Moralizing without listening creates resistance. Excessive urgency without a clear path to action triggers skepticism. Techniques to enhance persuasion are practical and ethical. Start by asking diagnostic questions to surface the audience's real objections and values. Reflect those objections back to show understanding, then present the solution measured against those concerns, emphasizing small, manageable steps rather than sweeping demands. Use social proof judiciously. Stories of peers who benefited are more convincing than raw statistics because humans are social learners. Chapter 8. Emotional mastery is the quiet architecture of effective thought. This chapter explains how to regulate feelings so that they inform rather than derail decision-making. Emotions are neither enemies nor unalloyed friends. They are data signals that, when interpreted accurately, enrich judgment. The first task is to develop emotional awareness. Many people confuse feelings with facts, reacting as if their momentary mood fully represents reality. To counter this, build a habit of labeling emotions precisely. Naming an emotion reduces its intensity and increases your capacity to choose a response. The chapter provides a simple 3-step emotion control loop. Notice the emotion, name it, and decide on an intentional response. This pause creates a space where reasoning can be applied. The chapter outlines common emotional distortions that hijack thinking: catastrophic forecasting, personalization, and emotional generalization. Recognizing these patterns allows you to correct them. Practical techniques follow. Controlled breathing and brief physical movement reduce the physiological arousal that feeds impulsive actions. Cognitive reframing, in which you ask whether the perceived threat is immediate or hypothetical, reshapes the interpretation of events. Cultivating gratitude and curiosity as default modes enlarges the range of acceptable responses and reduces reactivity. Chapter 9. The organization of your ideas into systems is the operational leverage that distinguishes thoughtful people from productive doers. This chapter shows how to design personal systems that convert thought into repeatable results. Systems are not exotic. They are consistent processes, feedback loops, and storage mechanisms that free cognitive space for high-value thinking. The chapter begins by defining the difference between projects and systems. Projects are discrete efforts with beginnings and ends. Systems are ongoing arrangements that produce predictable outcomes without reinventing the wheel each time. Examples range from simple inbox management routines to strategic planning cadences that guide quarterly priorities. Building a system starts with mapping desired outcomes and identifying the bottlenecks that prevent their consistent achievement. Once the bottleneck is found, design a minimal process that addresses it directly. Systems must be specific, measurable, and modest enough to be sustained. The chapter stresses the importance of documentation. A system that exists only in your head is not transferable and will break under pressure. Write down the steps, the timing, and the decision rules. Automation and delegation are natural extensions. When repeatable decisions can be automated with technology or assigned to competent people, the system scales. Feedback loops are crucial. Embed checkpoints that measure performance and force honest review. Chapter 10. Leadership of one's own mental life naturally extends to leading others. And this chapter explores the principles that convert personal mastery into positive influence in groups. Leadership here is defined not by title, but by the capacity to shape outcomes through clarity, integrity, and example. The first principle is clarity of purpose. A leader who cannot articulate a compelling, concise objective cannot align others. The chapter recommends distilling any group aim into a single sentence that answers why it matters and how success will be recognized. Second is the alignment of words and deeds. Credibility is fragile. It is built only when actions consistently match stated values. This alignment creates trust, and trust multiplies the influence of every subsequent decision. Third is distributed responsibility. Effective leaders do not hoard decision-making. They design decision zones and empower others to act within clearly defined boundaries. This both accelerates execution and builds ownership among team members. Communication practices recommended are straightforward. Set expectations early, provide timely feedback, and create forums for dissenting views to surface constructively. The chapter also emphasizes culture as the operating system of any group. Culture is shaped by repeated behaviors, reward structures, and enforced boundaries. Leaders shape culture by rewarding desired actions and disciplining harmful conduct swiftly and transparently. Chapter 11. The mastery of persistence is the silent currency of achievement, and this chapter treats persistence not as stubbornness, but as a disciplined continuity of purposeful action. Persistence begins with a clear, charged purpose that supplies motivation when enthusiasm fades. Purpose alone is not sufficient. Persistence is the habitual follow-through that converts intention into outcome. The chapter maps persistence into practical habits, steady scheduling, small reliable commitments, and visible progress markers that prevent discouragement. Rather than heroic endurance, persistence functions like compound interest. Modest, consistent deposits accumulate into disproportionate advantage. The psychology behind persistence is explored. Resistance, doubt, and external setbacks are inevitable, but they are not fatal if framed as information rather than as verdicts. Each obstacle can be interrogated for the lesson it holds and then used to adapt the approach. The chapter introduces the idea of micro-commitments, tiny, repeatable actions that are deliberately easy to perform, yet are aligned with the larger purpose. These micro-commitments reduce friction and build identity. When the mind experiences itself as someone who performs the small thing daily, identity shifts and larger tasks become psychologically accessible. The chapter stresses accountability. Public declarations to trusted peers and short accountability check-ins create social pressure that elevates follow-through. Importantly, the accountability must be supportive rather than shaming. It should celebrate progress and reframe failure as a learning event with a corrective path. The role of rituals is highlighted. Rituals are reliable anchors that convert desire into routine. Chapter 12. The discipline of habits is the architecture on which consistent thinking rests, and this chapter outlines how to design habits that serve your strategic aims. Habits are automaticized behaviors that economize attention and free the conscious mind for high-level problems. To purposefully shape habits, begin by identifying keystone behaviors that disproportionately influence other areas of life. Keystones are leverage points, a simple exercise routine, a nightly review ritual, or a focused planning session can cascade into improved energy, better decisions, and clearer priorities. The habit design process is simple, yet often neglected. First, make the action obvious by tying it to existing routines or environmental cues. Second, make the action attractive by bundling it with something you enjoy or by reframing its immediate benefits. Third, make the action easy by removing friction and lowering activation energy. Fourth, make the action satisfying with immediate feedback or small rewards. Over time, these steps convert effortful acts into near-effortless defaults. The chapter delves into habit stacking as a practical tactic. Attach a new, small habit to an established one so the old habit cues the new. This reduces reliance on willpower and creates sequential momentum. Monitoring matters. Keeping a visible habit tracker or a simple checklist reinforces the behavioral loop and provides data for incremental adjustment. The chapter discusses the ethical dimension of habit design. Chapter 13. The stewardship of attention is a modern leadership skill, and this chapter treats attention as the limited resource that must be allocated deliberately. Attention is attracted to novelty, urgency, and emotion, which often means that trivial matters hijack the agenda. To own your mind, you must protect your attention with rules and rituals. First, do an attentional audit. Map where your attention currently goes and classify items by importance and return on investment. Replace habitual reactivity with a decision framework that distinguishes the essential from the merely urgent. The chapter prescribes a scarce asset approach. Treat attention like capital and invest it where it yields highest strategic returns. Practical tools follow. Time boxing, single tasking, and deep work sessions reduce context switching and preserve cognitive bandwidth. Digital hygiene matters. Curate notifications, schedule dedicated email and messaging windows, and reserve distraction-free periods for complex tasks. The chapter suggests a daily attention plan. Identify no more than 2 high-focus objectives for the day and protect them with firm boundaries. Emotional attention is also considered. Attention conscripted by worry or resentment is attention lost. Chapter 14. The balance between intellectual confidence and humility is essential for accurate thinking, and this chapter explores how to hold both simultaneously. Confidence fuels action, humility protects against overreach. Accurate thinking requires a stance of provisional certainty. Commit to a decision when warranted, but remain open to evidence that contradicts it. The chapter introduces mental models as tools for testing beliefs. A diverse toolbox of frameworks, principles of causality, statistical intuition, incentive thinking, helps detect when an intuition is likely to be right or when it is a mirage. The author emphasizes the value of dissent. Seek contrarian perspectives and treat them as instruments for stress, testing your ideas rather than personal attacks. Cognitive diversity, whether through advisors, peers, or curated reading, reduces blind spots. Bias mitigation is practical. Set default rules like the disconfirmation requirement. Actively look for evidence that would change your mind and rate that evidence honestly. Use structured pre-mortems to surface failure modes and design contingencies. The chapter discourages fearful indecision masked as humility. Sincere humility includes the courage to act with the best available information. Chapter 15. Financial literacy and the psychology of wealth are practical competencies for anyone who wishes to own their mind and their future. This chapter demystifies money as information and incentive structures rather than as an abstract moral test. Understand your money habits, track inflows and outflows, identify leaks, and set saving rules that automate future security. The psychology of scarcity is explored. When money feels tight, attention narrows and decision quality declines. Building a margin, Small reserves and predictable saving restores cognitive bandwidth and reduces costly stress. The chapter presents basic financial rules that serve mental freedom. Pay yourself first. Create predictable budgets that align with priorities and focus on high-return investments in education, health, and productive assets. Leverage and risk are explained in behavioral terms. Leverage multiplies outcomes but also magnifies errors. Treat leverage as a strategic tool used selectively and with explicit stop-losses. The chapter urges avoiding the double error of both reckless speculation and paralyzing fear. Chapter 16. The cultivation of focus through meaningful work is the content of a fulfilled life, and this chapter argues that meaning is created, not discovered by accident. Purposeful work aligns personal strengths with market realities and human need. To create meaning, start with clarity about your contribution. What unique combination of skills and temperament do you bring, and where does the world value that combination? The chapter proposes a practical alignment exercise. List your core skills, list problems you enjoy solving, and find intersections that are both marketable and motivating. The chapter stresses that meaningful work requires craft. Competence develops through deliberate practice and thoughtful feedback. Seek environments that accelerate learning through exposure to tough but fair demands, and mentors who can both challenge and support. Autonomy and mastery are central ingredients of meaningful labor. Design roles or projects that offer discretion in approach and measurable metrics of progress. The chapter also addresses resistance and monotony. Even meaningful work has repetitive elements. Structure these tasks to minimize cognitive drag and schedule them during low-energy periods so that your peak cognitive power is devoted to creative problem-solving. The social impact of meaningful work matters. Work that touches others and creates recognizable value feeds motivation over the long run. Finally, the chapter reorients ambition. Aim for sustained contribution rather than episodic glory. Meaning accrues when you see your work as part of a broader narrative of impact and when you steward your capabilities with humility and persistence. Chapter 17. Ethics and purpose are twin anchors for a mind in charge of its destiny, and this chapter places moral clarity at the center of mental ownership. Ethics are not merely abstract ideals, but decision rules that simplify complex choices when stakes are high. A clear moral code reduces cognitive friction and prevents costly missteps that arise from reactive rationalization. The chapter proposes a compact ethical framework. Act transparently where possible, prefer agreements that respect all parties, and prioritize long-term reputation over short-term gain. The role of dignity is emphasized. Treating others with respect is not only humane but strategically smart because relationships compound in value over time. The chapter also examines the tension between consequentialism and principle. Good leadership requires both sensitivity to outcomes and fidelity to certain boundaries. Rules of thumb reduce paralysis. Do not deceive, keep promises unless the cost of enforcement is disproportionate, and correct mistakes quickly and publicly when they occur. The author insists on the self-regulating power of moral clarity. When your decisions are aligned with your stated values, your mental load decreases and your credibility grows. Finally, the chapter explores purpose as the practical extension of ethics. Purpose channels effort toward a coherent end and gives ethical decisions a context. Living with purpose and integrity cultivates internal peace and external trust, which together expand the range of options available to a well-governed mind. Chapter 18. Legacy. Thinking reframes present decisions through the lens of future impact, and this chapter invites you to consider what your decisions create beyond immediate returns. Legacy is not only about monuments or public recognition, but about the cumulative pattern of choices that shape others' lives and the systems you leave behind. The chapter encourages a horizon test. Before major decisions, ask how this choice would read in the account of your life 3 decades from now. This perspective filters trivial gains and highlights actions that compound positive outcomes for others. Practical legacy work includes mentoring, building reproducible systems, and documenting lessons learned so the next generation benefits from hard-earned insight. The chapter discusses institutional legacy versus personal legacy. Institutional legacy is the procedural and cultural imprint left on organizations you help to build. Personal legacy is the influence you exert through relationships, example, and the people you choose to elevate. Both require intentionality. The author outlines small daily acts that contribute to legacy, offering time to a promising person, writing brief notes that codify practices, and modeling behavior under pressure so that others internalize standards. The chapter also addresses risk and humility in legacy building. Do not assume that your model is universal. Cultivate successors and encourage them to adapt rather than imitate blindly. The final practice is a simple ritual of legacy design. Write a short letter to someone you hope will carry forward an idea or a practice and place it where you will see it weekly. Over time, these letters become a living curriculum that guides choices and amplifies impact. Legacy thinking transforms ordinary decisions into contributions and turns personal mastery into a resource that outlasts any single lifetime. Chapter 19. Teaching and Mentorship convert private mastery into public leverage, and this chapter treats the act of helping others learn as both a responsibility and a growth strategy for the teacher. Mentorship is not mere advice. It is the deliberate transfer of patterns, processes, and judgment, things that are hard to read in a transcript but evident in behavior. Effective teaching begins with diagnosing the learner's actual level and aspirations. If you aim at imagined competence, you waste time. If you target current realities, you accelerate progress. The next essential step is scaffolding. Break complex skills into linked, progressively demanding steps that allow the mentee to experience repeated success and to internalize foundational moves. Scaffolding is not patronizing, it is efficient. It prevents cognitive overload and preserves confidence while expanding capability. The teacher's role shifts as competence grows, from direct instruction to facilitation, from demonstration to critique, and finally, to sponsorship. Feedback is the currency of mentorship. High-quality feedback is timely, specific, and oriented toward next actions. Generic praise or diffuse criticism are both wasteful. Teach people what to do next and how to measure it. Modeling matters more than talking. The habits you demonstrate in daily work, how you prioritize, how you respond under stress, how you synthesize conflicting information, carry 10 times the instructional power of your best lecture. The chapter also emphasizes the practical mechanics of teaching, create short, reusable training artifacts, codify decision rules, and capture common failure modes with corrective heuristics. These artifacts make your knowledge scalable and protect it from being lost if you move on. Mentorship must be selective. Invest disproportionate time in a few high-potential people and structure relationships with clear expectations and review cycles. Boundary setting prevents dependence. The goal is independent competence, not permanent reliance on your opinion. Emotional intelligence is crucial. Empathy calibrates the pace of instruction and strengthens trust, while candor builds respect. Courage is necessary too, saying hard truths and withholding praise until behavior meets standards. The chapter warns against the vanity of visible mentorship that prioritizes flattering associations over real development. The real metric is whether the mentee performs when unsupervised. Finally, mentorship is reciprocal. Chapter 20. Integration completes the cycle. Owning your mind is not an accumulation of isolated skills, but the orchestration of habits, systems, values, and relationships into a coherent operating model. This chapter synthesizes the mental disciplines covered previously into a durable practice for steady performance and adaptive growth. Begin by designing a personal operating system, a compact set of routines that cover planning, learning, decision-making, review, and renewal. Keep the system small enough to be credible in daily life, yet comprehensive enough to manage recurring challenges. A useful architecture includes regular planning cadences, a prioritized attention ledger, a habit scaffold for the keystone behaviors that sustain energy and focus, and a learning loop that converts experience into revised principles. Measurement matters. What gets measured enters the agenda. What is invisible drifts. Track a handful of leading indicators that predict health, productivity, and progress. Review them weekly with curiosity rather than judgment, and use the data to adjust rather than to punish. The chapter insists on the centrality of adaptive routines, rituals that provide stability but contain explicit review points where the system is revised in light of new evidence. This combination of stability and plasticity prevents both chaotic improvisation and brittle stagnation. Social design is integrated too. Cultivate a small set of peers who give honest feedback, a few mentors who stretch your perspective, and protégés who force clarity through teaching. Social architecture is your human infrastructure. Invest in it like a strategic asset. The chapter also addresses cognitive maintenance. Mental ownership requires active care. Sleep, focused recovery, movement, and deliberate disengagement are not luxuries, but inputs that sustain high-quality thought. Protect these inputs as non-negotiables in your operating budget. The role of rituals for passage and recalibration is highlighted. Periodic retreats, structured pauses for synthesis, and rituals of closure after large projects let the mind consolidate learning and refill reserves. Lastly, integrate ethics and purpose into daily decisions so that your operating model is not merely efficient but meaningful.